Hello, welcome back to the readings of To MILELE. I'm so glad you've joined me for chapter 3. We were left in chapter 2 with Boa having a meeting with other agri or agricultural team leaders with Governor Peter wanting approval for a plan on the island, Eden 2. But they were having trouble because of administrative staff, and so Agios has stepped in, and we see how Agios has a great influence on the island. We also met Nathaniel David Kanisha, shortened to Nathan, who is Hope's twin brother. Now, the last name Kanisha has a special meaning in Swahili. It means church. At the back, actually, of this book is a glossary with words that have special meanings, whether in different languages or whatever, that play into the story. We also met Keiko Bayes, Kakobeyz, who is the world envoy who bridges the gaps between countries during this post-apocalyptic time. And he has a special interest in Hope, not a romantic one, but for other reasons. And we also met Tasabe, who is Keiko's bodyguard, and he is an interesting character as well. We also met Justin McNeil, one of the Agri team leaders who works with Boa. And we were introduced more to the hub, this place that is filled with offices as well as dorm spaces, and the Nutrition and Wellness Center where Hope works as the nutritionist for the island. So let's jump right into chapter 3. It didn't take Lieutenant Gideon Mandela long to realize that the giant of a man before him had no communication device in his dripping headgear. The man wore a protective suit from head to toe, and while obviously trespassing, stood facing him with a defiant stance. Behind the man, the backdrop of choppy sea battering his small submarine, along with Eden 2's water patrol approaching it, seemed to predict his fate, nullifying any sense of hope the golden sunset might have inspired. How the man had managed to swim through the undercurrents was a mystery to Gideon, until he noticed a small lifeboat bobbing at the water's edge. The man took a step up the slope. "I told you I'll blast your legs from under you if you so much as move a toe," Gideon growled. He'd been on foot patrol, the secondary role to his primary pilot patrol duties, when he noticed suspicious activity along the edge of the cliff just below Agri 1. He'd almost missed it too. He'd been caught up whistling the tune to a South African song about his ancestors' struggles. Struggles that had given his generation freedom from oppression, and reminded the world that he was standing on the mountaintop, not because of his already incredibly successful life, but because of his dogged loyalty to Prince Adani. To him, Eden 2 was another mountaintop, and he was pretty serious about protecting it. He kept his firearms steadily trained on his target, waiting for security backup from the nearby guard station. Finally, he heard them clambering down the gradual slope to the water's edge. At his command, the intruder was cautiously approached by 2 of the men and expertly patted down before being roughly handcuffed. "First time I've seen one come in a suit, sir," remarked a soldier, frowning at the captive. It was cause for concern. Where had the man gained access to a lightweight NASA suit redesigned just 2 years before the mist for outer space civilian tours? The suit, dubbed the P suit, PEA, was now commonly used for scientific studies in the mist patch, or to outfit visiting dignitaries who didn't have Eden 2 DNA. "Let's take him in," Gideon said. His words were almost drowned out by one of the military helicopters now patrolling the island for any more suspicious activity. Below, in the water, the submarine was being hauled onto the steep shoreline by water patrol. We're at a new scene. Bowen noticed the difference right away. Every time Keiko Bays was on the island, he recognized the shift in aura. Something is wrong with this picture, he grumbled under his breath. He ran a hand through his wet hair. The dissonant combination of soap fragrance and the odor of soiled laundry didn't help his state of mind. You're grumbling to yourself again. He turned to see an older man, Vohan Batten, the Agri 3 assistant, eyeing him critically. They'd both stepped out of the showers, towels around their waist, in surroundings set up like a typical men's locker room. It was an easy solution for the agricultural workers to have communal showers where their soiled laundry could easily be collected by the housekeeping team and replaced in labeled lockers. The women's facility was in a different hall. Being director of the agri teams afforded Boa his own private quarters outside the main building, the hub, but he had opted for the same treatment as the agri men and women who comprised most of the population of Eden 2. Seems to happen whenever His Majesty arrives, Boa explained as he bent to retrieve his dirty laundry. He stuffed it in one of the canvas hampers conveniently positioned outside the shower stalls. You get that too? Vohan asked, pausing, pushing his thick graying hair back from his forehead. You bet, Boa responded. It wasn't an issue for me when he first started coming a few years ago. But lately, I don't know. Something about him seems different. Boa studied the older man, who was in his late 50s, but still well built, and of average height and frame, gray eyes. He didn't know much about him other than that, before the asteroid, Vohan's small business had failed and his wife had run off with another man. Even so, he was one of the most easygoing men Boa knew. If there was a congeniality contest, he would have had it in the bag. So his negative comment about Keiko Bays said a lot. Vohan shifted out of the way for another man to enter the stall behind him. Maybe it's because things are more tense around him now, Vohan said. You know, since he's been declared friend of the world and all. The man about to enter the stall paused and turned to look at them. Friend of the world? You've got to be kidding. Well, Justin, Boa addressed his Agri-1 assistant. Definitely his official role as mediator among the countries is important. But I don't know. Boa shook his head. Especially since he started traveling with that bodyguard of his. Man gives me the creeps. You too? Glad to know I'm not the only one. Justin's grin was full of youthful mischievousness as he disappeared into the shower stall. Boa chuckled. As easygoing as Vohan was, Justin McNeil was the opposite. He questioned everything. Even Agios seemed to need an extra ounce of patience when dealing with Justin. However, Boa had to admit he was one of their best workers, if not the best. At 21 years old, he was a lean mass of excess energy with curious hazel eyes and a mound of springy blonde hair. His parents, a set of grandparents, and 2 teenage sisters still lived under the mist. He worked hard to make a difference for them. Boa turned back to Vohan, but further conversation was hindered by the sudden intermittent blast of an alarm. The usual male clamor in the shower facility immediately ceased. Lockdown. Groans of annoyance filled the room as locks across the entire compound engaged. There was no way to tell how long they would have to wait until the locks disengaged, or whether it was a routine drill or a real breach of security. No one except the governor and military personnel could go in or out. Boa remembered one of the most interesting breaches of security 6 months ago, when a small, old airplane suddenly appeared out of the mist. Since they rarely had to deal with aircrafts, it had taken them completely by surprise. Boats and ships were regular intruders. It had been considered an act of stupidity or desperation for the young, elite military pilot from South Africa to have attempted what was tantamount to suicide. That is, until they discovered how he had skillfully strategized his way across the Atlantic to Eden 2. After security clearance and Agios's assurance, Gideon Mandela had been recruited to Eden 2's military, one of the fortunate few allowed to stay after breaching the usual recruitment process. It hadn't taken long for the cocky, bright-eyed pilot to prove his worth and be promoted to lieutenant. His charming, friendly disposition, along with his smooth, dark-skinned good looks, made him a favorite on the island. If a tune was being whistled or a spontaneous song was heard, it was most likely Lieutenant Gideon Mandela, whom we met in the first scene. However, many people still refused to believe Eden 2 could only be inhabited by a select group. They believed their governments were holding out on them due to reasons ranging from secret conspiracies to alien invasion. Refugees regularly appeared through the mist to the clear atmosphere of the mysterious island in the middle of the Atlantic. After he finished dressing, Bull looked above a group of lockers to a large clock on the wall. The uncertain wait time was definitely a trigger for the hunger pangs now churning in his gut. New scene. Hope was walking along the left corridor with Nathan when the alarm sounded. Their closest secure door access was Dr. Janice Misra's office in the laboratory. Dr. Misra, head of science research, was sitting at a small table poring over lab reports when they burst in, invading her space. Seconds later, the sound of the door's lock engaging had sealed their common fate of an unexpected visit. Hope couldn't help but smile at Dr. Misra's quick response after she and Nathan had barreled into the room. "Well, Miss Kanisa, Mr. Kanisa," said the petite woman. She wore a white lab coat and her straight black hair, slightly streaked with gray, was rolled up into a bun. "I was beginning to wonder when I'd have the privilege of an interview with you both. It's certainly been a while since the last one." She eyed them over the top of her reading glasses before continuing in her faint Hindi accent. "And it is an added bonus having you both at once." Hope mirrored Nathan's wary look as they snuck glances at each other. Since Hope was more familiar with Dr. Misra and her combative tendencies, Hope took the lead. "So sorry for interrupting, Doctor." "No need for apologies," Dr. Misra interrupted, waving her hand. "We know it's a matter of course to be taken. What I would like is an information update on you both while we have the time." Her gaze pinned Nathan. "And while you're away from that very demanding man you work for." Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "How are you, Dr. Misra?" "I'm well, thank you. You, on the other hand, seem rather stressed." "I completely understand. Under the circumstances." She looked at Hope. "Shall we do some blood work?" "Well, I guess," Hope started answering, then faltered, feeling empathy for her brother, who wasn't used to dealing with a petite, energetic woman on a regular basis. Wonderful, Dr. Misra said, smiling. As she rose from her seat, her white lab coat opened like a robe of royalty, exposing a purple blouse beneath. She was queen in her domain. Indeed, in her former life, not only had she faced widowhood at an early age and the death of a daughter, her only child, but she'd been a top biochemical researcher. I know, Hope, that you like to make a regular nuisance of yourself here when it comes to understanding the differences in Eden 2's crop at the biochemistry level, but it's like pulling teeth just to have you come for a 15-minute exam. Feeling sufficiently scolded, Hope obediently followed Dr. Misra, glancing back at Nathan as he trailed behind her. His dark brown eyes sparkled, and his natural tan skin was slightly flushed. He winked, grinning. Behind the immediate office space was a long hallway leading to other rooms, all specific to different science experiments. A small morgue was also housed in the facility. To date, the morgue had only been used for the few unfortunate refugees who'd expired soon after reaching the island. So far, no Eden 2 dweller had died. Hope had to admit that Dr. Misra was accurate about her thirst for knowledge. It was important in her role as Director of Nutrition and Wellness for the residents of the island, but also for the world's population that received food assistance from Eden 2. They'd started on Eden 2 growing crops 3 years ago and found differences in the general appearance, taste, and odor of everything. Everything. It all seemed better, more suitable for human consumption, as if what they'd been consuming before had somehow missed the mark, were merely cousins of the real thing. Yet those cousins were now producing superior crops on Eden 2. Fruit trees had started producing a year ago with multiple yields throughout the year. It was another mystery of the island that growing seasons were unlimited. Dr. Misra headed for a cabinet-lined wall behind a gleaming stainless steel table. Hope noticed Nathan looking out one of the glass doors. Uniformed soldiers were roaming the corridor. She patted his back gently, meaningfully, as they waited by the table for Dr. Misra. Relax, Hope said to him. Even Keiko Bays can't interrupt a lockdown and demand your presence right now. She giggled. For all we know, he's locked in somewhere with Boa. Nathan rubbed a hand across his forehead. He smiled. Wouldn't that be interesting? Hope studied him, realizing again how she missed his honesty, quiet strength, and reliable intelligence. She would describe herself as sufficiently intelligent and mellow. He was a solemn genius. What are you smiling at? Nathan asked, looking at her quizzically. He slowly ran a hand over his short, springy black curls. Was she smiling? Hope shrugged and impulsively reached up to give him a brief hug. Her brother was beautiful, not in the way Keiko was, for Keiko was one of the most beautiful men Hope had ever seen, but in a more wholesome way. Keiko's beauty was restless and craved attention. Nathan's drew attention without the demand. Stepping back, Hope looked up at him. I'm just so happy you're here. Nathan returned her smile and patted the top of her head awkwardly. Same here, he agreed. Now that you've both caught up on your sibling bliss, Dr. Misra interrupted, please join me over here. Dr. Misra had placed 2 folders on the stainless steel table next to a container with medical supplies. One folder was more padded than the other. Hope guessed hers was the heavier. She was, after all, the most sought-after guinea pig on Eden 2. It was thought that there must be a specific uniqueness to her gene that was still to be identified. The hope was that it would be transferable via a vaccine. But so far, that theory had proven unreliable. Apparently, the rest of the world also wanted to get their hands on her DNA, but she had refused a bodyguard. Certainly, that was unnecessary on Eden too. But even without her permission, she knew that security had been secretly assigned to her. Sit, Dr. Misra commanded, waving her hand at two stools nearby. They sat. New scene. Gideon stood at attention outside the dome. The dome was a large glass room named for its shape in the interrogation and debriefing chamber. The interrogation and debriefing chamber was the most secure room in the main military building and was also accessed under strict military accessed under strict military protocol. A third of its cavernous space was occupied by the dome, which had been built along its back wall, situated under solar panel lights, which aided in its specially maintained atmosphere. Though he was now used to its impressive architecture, Gideon still marveled at the dome's hemispherical, seamless glass structure, which was unlike any other in the world and had been designed by a team of genius engineers and scientists. Also impressive was the man held inside the dome, sitting on a plastic chair with his hands unbound. He was well over 6 feet and extremely well built, probably in his early 30s, with short, straight black hair. Though he had been stripped of his protective gear down to a blue t-shirt and matching athletic pants, his form, his stance, and his gaze spoke of power and authority. The carefully maintained atmosphere inside the dome guaranteed his survival until his status was known. Results from blood works to determine his DNA were pending. Now, this was the man that had appeared at the water's edge. Gideon sharpened his focus on the ongoing interrogation of the detained man by Colonel Daniel Davenport. He was the top military commander of Eden II. The man had told them his name was Michael Zanshi, and that he had journeyed from South Korea. 3 hours had passed since his discovery, and weariness had set in. It seemed more for them than for him. Who else knew about your plans to travel to the island? Colonel Davenport asked, his voice steely and uncompromising. He was a stout, big-boned man in his early 50s with salt and pepper curls, gray eyes, and a sculpted English accent. People don't just acquire submarines on their own, he continued, speaking into an intercom system at the control desk close to the dome. Michael Sanshi stayed silent for a moment. Then he replied, I'm military, special ops. I borrowed it. Even through the dome's automated intercom, his voice sounded reserved with controlled tension, like someone used to giving orders rather than taking them. Silence reigned. Michael looked at each of them, squinting against the bright lights in the dome. I know it's hard for you to believe, but it wasn't that difficult obtaining one. Things are crazy in the rest of the world, even with martial law. It's not as easy to keep track of everyone living under the cloud. Gideon couldn't help but feel Michael's explanation, true or false, was more for their benefit than his own. He also noticed that the man would periodically focus an expectant stare toward the room's entrance as if waiting for something or someone. Living under a cloud might be preferably to being exposed to a world you can't survive in, Colonel Davenport growled. A young corporal sitting at the control desk recording the information kept a poker face, but Gideon guessed he felt the same as he, that they were witnessing two bulls in a pen. Michael wasn't budging, but neither was the colonel. Law and order were paramount on the island. They couldn't survive and function any other way. Eden 2 dwellers knew it and accepted it. As much as they helped the world would easily turn against them, just to trade places. "I'll take my chance," Michael replied confidently, almost defiantly. Gideon felt a grudging respect, but he also understood the colonel, who'd left his former life for the sake of bringing law and order to Eden 2. That decision had left him divorced, and his ex-wife, who'd not been able to live on the island, had resented his choice. Colonel Davenport slowly turned away from the dome. For a moment he seemed in deep thought. Then he faced the detained man again and stated emphatically, "In this place, son, chances aren't up to you." The entrance doors suddenly opened, creating a momentary distraction. A young woman in a white lab coat passed briskly between two military guards stationed outside the doorway and into the tightly secured interrogation and debriefing chamber. Colonel Davenport turned to her expectantly. She handed a large sealed envelope to him, then stepped to one side. Colonel Davenport pulled a full-length sheet of paper from the envelope and examined it. He frowned and looked at Michael. "It seems you're right not to worry. But even though you have Eden 2 DNA, I'm still wondering about the suit and the sub." The doors opened again, and further interrogation was left dangling. Michael immediately stood to his feet, suddenly at attention. "Release him, Daniel. He means no harm." Agios had walked into the room. He stood beside the colonel, staring into the dome. Gideon's senses heightened, and Agios's gaze fastened on him. "Assign him to Gideon. Give him the status of agent. You will need him in the days ahead." Colonel Davenport stood in rigid silence, his face a study of concentration. The corporal, looking up with mouth partly open, had ceased recording. Agios spoke to Michael. "Keep your wits about you. Learn all you can while you are here. Be sober, be vigilant." Then Agios turned and walked out of the room. He was gone, like the wind. Colonel Davenport moved, shook his head, and cleared his throat. He looked at Gideon, then at Michael. "Well, let's see now. Where were we?" But Gideon knew what would happen. The colonel would go through the motions of further interrogation, but in the end, he would follow Agios's advice. Michael would be released to Gideon's charge, and in that, Gideon felt a true purpose, as if something had just been confirmed. That's the end of chapter 3. I hope you will join me for chapter 4. Take care.